We've heard, a lot over the past couple days about how important it is to do the kinds of research that's being discussed, really with the end goal of treating these disorders. And so I guess it's fitting that as we get towards the end of the meeting that we get together to talk about treatment. And here we're talking about drug treatment. Obviously, that's not the only kinds of treatments that we need for PTSD and TBI. But the panel we have with us today is 4 individuals from the pharmaceutical industry. Just get you to raise your hand. I'll give you quick introductions if that's okay. So starting with Jeff Sabados. Jeff's the CEO of Resilience Therapeutics. Next to Jeff is Dr. Adam Rosenberg. Adam is the president and CEO of Rodin Therapeutics. And then Larry Hardy with Sunovion Pharmaceuticals. Larry is the director of pharmacology in the Discovery and Preclinical Research Group. And next to me, Dr. Lara Sullivan, who's vice president with Pfizer Cures at Pfizer. So what we're going to do is we don't have slides. I'm going to kind of kick things off with a few questions just to get the discussion started. In fact, anybody can feel free to answer. If not, I'll pick on you. And then I hope that we will have a fair bit of time for discussion, because we really would like to hear what other members of the audience would like to know. So I promised I'd start off really easy, that I'd kind of softball things. So let me start with an easy question. Which of you is most to blame for the fact that we don't have good drugs for PTSD and TBI?
I get to be the scapegoat. So I'll start. Yes, we probably can and should hold Big Pharma accountable. And there's probably many other patient groups and disease areas that would feel the same. Since as rich and deep as those pockets are, they are still resource constrained. There's still 300 projects on average competing for funding inside a Pfizer, for example, every year, and there's probably 500 projects looking for funding. So there's a capital allocation question. That's just the natural order of things. That being said, I think what we're seeing, and this meeting is emblematic of, is that if we bring different stakeholder groups together that can provide capabilities in addition to just funding, we actually have a chance to work with the big pharmas of the world in a very different way, which should help us actually be able to identify and move forward compounds, whether it's inside these big companies or outside these big companies through government collaborations or licensing of compounds into smaller companies that have a dedicated focus. And that's really critical. Instead of trying to fight against the 300 or 500 other projects, let's just say, all right, we won't fight you on that. We'll find a different way to work together.
Yeah.
I could comment
Sure. Go ahead.
also. In a way, it's the best of times and it's the worst of times. In terms of pharmaceutical R&D and psychiatry generally, not just PTSD. Why do I say it's the best of times? Well, because of the tremendous advances that have been made in neurobiology and understanding the conserved neurocircuitry that's responsible for a lot of the dysfunctions that we see in these human psychiatric diseases, especially in PTSD, but not just PTSD. It's the worst of times because we've had so many clinical failures that most pharmas have pulled out of psychiatric R&D. And I think it's unfortunate. Our company is still in, Pfizer is still in, but there are precious few companies that are, and I think there's going to be a renaissance because of the rich science, and the renaissance is beginning with smaller companies really getting into this space and seeing the opportunity. So it's hard. It's a risky business. So there's no one place to point the finger. But I think there's going to be some tremendous advances in the near future.
Yes, just sort of turn it around on a more positive note. Why is there now more interest in developing treatments for PTSD and TBI? We now have actually a fair number of companies, many of them small, but not only, that are deciding to kind of get into this. So what's changed? Why does it sort of seem like a potentially ripe area right now? Either Adam or Jeff.
So I would say I agree with you. There is a renaissance coming, and I think we can point to neurodegeneration as an example of that. About 14 or 15 years ago, I co-founded a company with Peter Lansbury from Brigham and Women's, focused initially on alpha-synuclein and Parkinson's. And everybody looked at us like we were absolutely crazy. We had some compounds we had identified at pharma. We tried to in-license them. Just doors were shut. I think we're seeing a sea change in that, in neurodegeneration in particular. And it's not just the small companies, it's the big companies. Up in Cambridge where we are, we're seeing very large companies make very significant investments in particular in AD and PD, and we've heard a lot over the last few days with respect to the overlap between neurodegeneration and the pathophysiology in those areas, and potentially here as well. So I think, well, I agree with Larry that there's quite a bit of shrinkage of the number of companies that are in neuropsychiatric disease now. I think with some success will come back. And the smaller companies can drive that with innovation. The bigger companies need to be there because we have a very different lens when we're starting a discovery program than the larger companies do. But I am encouraged, and I like seeing more sort of pure play companies come at it. We're looking at it slightly different perspectives, similar mechanism with multiple disease areas. I think you're looking at it more single disease area with considering different mechanisms. So I am encouraged, and being the son of a psychiatrist, I hope that he has more tools at his disposal soon.
Yeah, and just to leverage what Adam said, I think, yeah, the time is now. Fortunately, like Magali said, billions of dollars has been spent over the past 15, 20 years, particularly since 9/11, with the DOD and VA for that matter. But what CVB is doing here, and why we're all under this, what I like to call this big tent, the big CVB tent, is that Magali and our team are just providing such incredible thought leadership and competency to all the different programs coming together. The plight of a lot of academic research and research that's been done across the country, across the globe for that matter, is it's very siloed sometimes, and it's hard to work together without one big umbrella. That's certainly what Magali and CVB is doing. So when we talk about the time is now, yes, there's all these new technological advances, particularly with imaging and identifying the different endpoints, so we can kind of move away from CAPS. But certainly it's everyone in this room coming here into DC, and I look forward to next year too, of really bringing a lot of people together and having the thought leadership, almost like a Michael J. Fox Foundation now for PTSD that says, we are in the trenches. And I always make this, even with my own company, and Resilience Therapeutics is a startup focused on PTSD with the best people, the greatest scientists in the world, a part of it. We're in the trenches. I wake up at 2 in the morning thinking about how I can help PTSD. And I feel like everyone in this room, and throughout my conversation the past 48 hours, was everyone is in this room is in the trenches too. And this really hasn't been done ever before. Not for the past 15 years when you think about very large conferences and what's engaged here, but this is a definitely different feel. So once again, thank you so much, Magali and CVB and everyone that's part of this, but the time is now because of everyone in this room.
Yeah, when you think about it, technical failures really are the incubator for innovation. And if there's any two groups that are unwilling to accept failure, it's scientists and the military, right? They will just keep going and trying. So, to Jeff's point, bringing those groups together into a forum like this, I think gives us a real fighting chance. And I would also say, I think on the big pharma side, and this is probably pervasive in the smaller companies too, I think we've started to view these diseases more in a lens similar to the way the thinking evolved with cancer, where you were looking more at constellations of symptoms or tumor types rather than locale of tumor. So rather than a discrete PTSD or a discrete depression, when we open up the breadth of application of the science inside big companies, that helps you compete for resources, right, and focused executive attention and so forth. So all of these factors combining, I completely agree, are setting us up for a renaissance of sorts.
What do people think about, you sort of talked about expanding the boundaries sort of beyond a single disorder, not sort of being constrained by that. How does the way you need to develop drugs for the FDA impact on that, on going forward with that kind of an approach? Anybody?
I'll take that on. So we're really focused again on the earliest stages of drug discovery, and the IND is, it's like real estate. It's safety, safety, safety. So we're really focused on getting the most potent, best molecule we can. We're at a point now, year and a half, 2 years to IND, where we know we've been able to design incredibly brain potent compounds with great PK and ADME, really attractive properties with the beginnings of a therapeutic index. The efficacy part comes a little later for us, frankly, and I think that's one of the things that Lara touched on is, we're really focused on the pathway and the mechanism, and not so much, does a mouse go left or right when it takes a drug. So from our perspective, it's right from the beginning. It's mechanism and it's safety, and that's why we start there, and then we start to explore different therapeutic areas. Now, for Rodin in particular, we are focused on Alzheimer's in part because our partner Biogen is obviously very focused in the area. So thinking about cognitive dysfunction in Alzheimer's is really where we spend most of our time from a preclinical efficacy perspective. But it's the entire world of cognitive disorders. Anywhere where synaptic plasticity could have some potential benefit. It might be a totally different dosing regimen. It might be, chronic intermittent dosing or acute dosing. One of the speakers this morning talked about sort of just tweaking the system through imaging and TMS. We're sort of thinking about the same thing with PTSD. Can we just give a little tweak, an acute boost to enhance synaptic plasticity, which would then make cognitive behavioral therapy that much more powerful? It's very different than a chronic, lifelong, super safe aspirin-like drug for an elderly patient with Alzheimer's. So for us, it really is, can we just get the best lead series of molecules that look like they're going to be really safe, whatever the application is? We'll have to fill in the efficacy part of the TI to be sure, but if we can start with great molecules that are CNS designed, neuroactive, we feel like we're at least going to answer the FDA part early. That's better than starting with, let's go find the most powerful, potent compounds we can and then sort of work back to try to make them more neuroactive and safer, and I learned that the hard way.
And now just to carry on with that, though, the plight and despair in PTSD, and particularly the drug pipeline that doesn't exist, there are some good opportunities with existing clinical assets, but there is not robust research like you're doing, like Pfizer has done, like other companies have done in developing lead series into drug candidates all the way through IND. There's a 5-year gap there. And when you think about what Kerry Ressler's doing, and has really exciting work with gene expression, he's going to be able to find and identify some incredible targets to go after. But each target is going to take $10 million to get to a drug, and those will fail multiple times. So there is this gigantic gap that exists. Most important thing that can happen over the next few years is obviously developing a translatable model for animals, but it's also just getting a drug through a phase 2 trial, and ideally phase 3 and register, just one. And the venture capital community will say, wow, you can get a drug, a drug through a PTSD trial. They always look at the 270 failures in the past, but if just one company gets it through, that brave company, you will break the glass. You will break the glass, and then we have hundreds of millions of dollars of venture capital coming in and say, let's do the CNS psych. Alzheimer's a great target, we get it. Parkinson's is very exciting, but the CNS psych is the venture capital community, when you think about all the great things that America and that the biotech industry has done, has really shied away from CNS psych. You break the glass, and you're going to see hundreds of millions of dollars going in, and we're going to live in a different world. That's my perspective, what I've seen in the past, and of course, what CVB is doing by kind of what I call the tip of the spear, of leading the way towards these diagnostics that they can then measure, and particularly in the clinic too, and help get, and then leveraging precision medicine too, to help get one drug, and hopefully 2, 3, 4 through the clinic will be just so important.
I think diagnostics are really going to be key to the future. One of the challenges that we have is, I know we're here to talk about pharmaceuticals from the small molecule or from the pharmacology point of view, but I think the future is going to be combinations. Combinations of what GSK calls electroceuticals. And devices or modulation other than the pill, drugs in the classic sense, as well as therapy. And those kinds of combinations are going to be the future of personalized medicine. How do you model those preclinically? How do you de-risk that? How do you understand how to do those kind of combinations? That's one of the big challenges in this area that I think we're going to have to struggle with in terms of making that discovery into development transition. Because like you, Adam, we've had a number of compounds that we've discovered, and I just have to throw out a pitch for a target agnostic point of view, a molecular target agnostic point of view. We're doing things in a fashion that was successful probably 40 or 50 years ago when psychiatric drugs were originally discovered inside our company. We're using behavior to actually drive chemistry. Not that we ignore the circuits or the pathways, because that's the next step. In order to get beyond face validity and into construct validity, we have to know that the things that we are tracking at the whole animal level are in conserved circuits, so that they're going to be relevant to humans, so they're going to be translatable. But the methods that we've used so far, and we work very closely with Emer and the folks at Psychogenics to make this progress. We have already managed to get into the beginning of phase 2 with a compound that was discovered in just that fashion. We have a number of other things behind it, and we're considering a whole variety of indications, similar to what you described for Rodin. But PTSD is one of those areas that we're thinking about getting into. And the efficacy question is a big one. And how we can challenge ourselves to understand how it can be used in the clinic in combination with other things. I really don't have the answer to that.
But I think that's exactly why you need to recognize the polypharmacology and the heterogeneity of the diseases, right? And what you've been doing at Sunovion is really on the leading edge of that. Of course, being the co-founder of a phenotypic screening company with zebrafish, I'm obviously sympathetic to what you're doing, a very different scale and throughput, and a little earlier on the evolutionary scale. But I think, to me, we're sort of hearing two things. We're hearing, are there drugs out there that might be suitable just to break through that phase 2 barrier? And then you're hearing, okay, can we get away from the single target drug discovery approach, which has worked incredibly well in cancer, as you say, also in diabetes, metabolic disorders. There are a lot of areas you can point to, but the brain is a very different place. And my perspective on this, having done 4 companies in neuroscience now, is it's really hard to start with a compound that was not designed to be CNS active. You're just thinking about completely different attributes of that molecule. So having been involved with the Fox Foundation in early days, they did, and they're still investing in compounds. There's a cancer compound they're just putting in now for PD. I think there's a real temptation. I understand it. There are a lot of good drugs out there with polypharmacology, and we can pick something up in a behavioral model we think might be relevant, and we all want to see drugs make progress. We all want to see drugs get approved. But from Foundation's perspective, and I think for the clinicians, there is a finite, even in this environment, there are finite resources. There are finite patient numbers. And we've got to be careful with how we allocate those patients and those resources. And so I guess I kind of am a little bit in between. I would love to find a CNS active molecule that was developed for some other indication. We're putting into these models, we see clear activity in PTSD and TBI. But I always have that skepticism that you just can't point to too many repurposing stories that have worked, at least into CNS. I mean, there have been...
So Adam, you've actually sort of alluded to resources that are going to be needed to sort of move this field ahead. I think people have talked about, obviously, finances. There's only so many targets you can go after. You've also talked about patients. What are other resources that are going to need to come together in order to advance these fields?
I would not underestimate the importance of operational capabilities and the ability to very quickly identify patients, get patients into trials, and the throughput of those patients. That is often a place where in big pharmas we have lots of resources or people, but which is a good thing and a bad thing, because lots of people create lots of work, and lots of work can create lots of process, and lots of process can slow things down. So we often find for some of the compounds, particularly in areas that are maybe just not in the core strategic focus areas, that they can progress much more quickly when we use resources outside of the big companies like clinical trial networks. And we're increasingly seeing those kinds of networks being set up by foundations and investigators who, frankly, are not going to sit around and wait for pharma to solve it for them, which is great, because that essentially then helps provide an inducement to get the pharmas to partner with them and provide more access to compounds. So it's less, sexy than a lot of things, but it's so essential, and it can make or break the economics for investors. And I think it's truly fundamental.
Yeah, I mean, right now, I think it's true in PTSD and TBI that, when a company, big or small, wants to do a trial, it's like starting from square one, finding investigators, finding sites. I think Alzheimer's has sort of taken the lead, and they've sort of followed the cancer center model of saying, no, you got a new drug ready to go. We've got things lined up. We've got operations, standard operating procedures in place. We kind of need that for PTSD and TBI.
Yeah, there's one foundation in an immunological-based disease that came to us and said, we've built our network now. We want to serve you an X compound, and they've gone through the same vendor qualification approaches that traditional CROs are doing, and they've done quite well. That's actually very transformative, because they're able to then come to Pfizer and say, we can do this at a third of the cost of the partners you might typically engage. Now imagine what that opens up in our pipeline for that group. And they've done that by working collaboratively amongst themselves. And so, to your point, Jeff, I think meetings like this where you can get the investigators and the sites networked, with foundation support, interested parties, in this case, governmental organizations, so you can make it happen very quickly, can really change the calculus rather swiftly.
I agree. That's one of the most important things that CVB can do is to help to build that network. Another resource that I think is going to be essential, and it's one of the reasons why I was so excited to see the results that Amit Etkin showed today, is diagnostics, objective diagnostics, to help us stratify patients, but also to be able to objectively quantify responses quickly.
I want to keep us on track, but I do want to give people a chance to ask questions. So let's open things up. Do we have questions from folks out there? We'll get the mics to people. Jonathan?
Hi, thanks. So I wondered if you could maybe speak a little bit to effect size. Because, we have two problems. One is the problem that's been alluded to all the last 2 days around heterogeneity and biomarkers and defining the population of sensitivity. And the other then is how you think about that vis-a-vis what, Lara, you were talking about in terms of, for example, combining drugs with electroceuticals or digital approaches. That you, for example, in at least in the population, you have some patients with a robust effect size from, say, desensitization types of, immersion approaches, exposure approaches, that would be the envy of, drug developers. You have effect sizes that, are approaching 1. So I just, and of course then you have the caps that you're using, which is almost kind of like a mini exposure in and of itself, because you're, kind of unpacking people's traumas and asking them. So I just wondered if you could speak a little bit of the effect size, because it's very interesting. It's in some ways encouraging if you get the right population. On the other hand, what would be ideal, Larry, is if you were able to put the those molecules for neuroplasticity together with the right consistent behavioral approaches. You might, will you be able? How will that work, and how will the FDA be thinking about that? But I wondered about just this effect size question more generally, and how you're thinking.
It's a great question. I don't really have a firm answer. The effect size in clinical trials, in order to really have a successful treatment, needs to translate into persistent effect sizes over time. The problems I'm sure you're aware with a lot of the either exposure or other kinds of psychotherapy, behavioral therapy approaches is that after people finish the course of the therapy, a lot of times the effects don't persist. And so seeing those in a clinical trial situation and having to persist are two different phenomena. I think identifying the right patient for the right therapeutic approach is going to be really key. I agree with you. We need to pay attention to effect sizes because for some of the approved drugs, the effect sizes are disappointing, especially over time.
Say the least.
Yeah, I think it's been clear that I actually saw Paula Schnur yesterday at another meeting talk about effect sizes in PTSD. And as you said, Jonathan, the exposure-based therapies, cognitive processing therapies, the effect sizes are much larger than any of the drugs we have. And in that case, actually, the effects are quite persistent. And we don't have drugs yet that get us those kinds of effect sizes, but that doesn't mean that those won't be developed. I think that's what we're all aiming for.
Right.
Question? Yeah.
So Hugo Gates in Silico Biosciences. So it takes like 10 years, 12 years to develop a drug from, let's say, target identification, validation to on the market. Now, given the fact that there are so many patients out there that are waiting for therapeutic interventions, what do you think about drug repurposing as a kind of way to de-risk programs and to actually accelerate possible successful treatments for PTSD or TBI?
Who wants to take that?
Well, I'll take a shot at that, having suffered PTSD myself. I think there's a lot of benefit with repurposing for symptom relief and not necessarily going after the underlying neurobiology problem with the circuits associated with PTSD. And so if you remove certain symptoms, whether it be hyperarousal or sleep for that matter, in 2005, if I had gotten better sleep, I would have been a much better individual. So there is some opportunity for just going after symptom relief as we move forward. The other opportunity I want to shed light on too is in something that can be done not in 10 or 15 years, but in 3 to 4 years for that matter, is really being able to identify the different types of PTSD like the last panel just talked about. When you can start putting your hands around having, for PTSD sufferers, what kind of type they have, whether it's type 2 hyperarousal connected to some kind of gene expression or the particular genes they have and different biomarkers. When you can start putting your hands around what kind of PTSD you have, type 2, type 3, type 4, and it's translatable between the mouse model and the patients. The mice, you can obviously, it's very important because you can control for some factors. Genes for that matter. In humans, you can't control how someone was raised and born or their childhood trauma, the type of chronic stress they have, the type of genes they've had, and then the type of trauma they had. And then, having been a Navy SEAL, you show me someone's family and their upbringing and their social environment, I'll show you what kind of PTSD they have. You can't control for all that. In the mouse model, you can. And being able down the road to be able to connect those two and really, with confidence, say that someone has a type 2 PTSD or type 3 or whatever Magali and her leadership and this group of people in this room in 3 years coming together, coming out with a publication to say, we want to, this is how we're identifying the PTSD and here's the data behind it. It's going to be powerful. It's going to make a huge impact for people that really want to get their hands around what kind of PTSD they can and then how can they control for it.
Jeff,
I don't want to lose that hope that within 3 years, 4 years, we can make an impact.
Jeff, one of the startling things that I learned in the last year is that there was a finding that John Crystal, I don't know if John is still here, but he was one of the investigators who found that you can actually pharmacologically cluster PTSD patients into ones that have an adrenergic sensitive phenotype and others that have a serotonergic sensitive phenotype, using yohimbine and MCPP. I was amazed that, and they don't overlap. I was amazed to find out that that has never been replicated. That study, which is over a decade ago that was done.
And I've seen a very robust for Army study where they've identified 3 different clusters. And so it's there, and the data is there. And that's something certainly with all the thought leaders here coming together and draft and putting together a white paper in 2-3 years and knowing what other data we still have to collect could be incredibly powerful. And that publication would be on the front page of the New York Times and broadcast hopefully to millions of people to say, I can put my hands around this kind of, just like people do with cancer and whatnot. I have this kind of PTSD, and I know this is how I can control for it.
I think you bring up a very good point about associated symptoms, and I know from the Parkinson's field, pimavanserin was recently approved for psychosis. Hans, they did, 3 or 4 different studies in different areas before finding the right niche. And I think, there are really important associated symptoms clearly in all these disorders, and just focusing solely on the cure is probably going to lead you down the wrong path. I think an earlier panel talked about looking at some of the other areas, whether it's sleep or arousal, whatever it might be. That's where the repurposing opportunity, I think, really exists. I think you're right, because they were typically developed for other CNS indications. My skepticism, my cynicism is when people take drugs from cancer, and again, I speak from experience here, drugs from cancer in other areas, and say, you know what? This drug's just sitting there, nobody's using it, get some interesting data from the animal model, let's try it. There's the network's great, the speed's great. You just don't want to see 2 or 3 suboptimal compounds go through, because if you, with all the right enthusiasm and the best of faith, if you put the wrong compounds forward in this network that's building up, it's gonna counteract.
Yeah, there's at least one example of repurposing already in PTSD. It's sort of a modest example, but prazosin, right? It's a drug been around for a long time. Murray Resk and Elaine Peskin kind of found serendipitously that it was useful in PTSD, and then now what they found is it's probably most useful, maybe not exclusively, but most useful in people who have higher blood pressure. So they've actually, gotten to the point where they've repurposed a drug. More work needs to be done in terms of saying it needs to be targeted at that particular group of individuals. But that's an example where that's happening. So I think, we need the repurposing of drugs to get things out there in the next couple of years. We need the new molecules being developed in order to get us better drugs in the future. Are we getting the hook? You want us to wrap up? One more question? Okay. Yeah, Seth?
Great. Thank you. Well, partially to talk about repurposing and then to ask a question. I'm with Tonix Pharmaceuticals, and we've repurposed cyclobenzaprine as a bedtime medicine to improve sleep quality. And we just reported in May a large phase 2 study where we had positive effects on the total CAP score in a group of military-related PTSD patients. So we're headed to phase 3. So I think that repurposing is a good pathway, especially for a complex disorder. But my question is, and it's my perspective, and I'm wondering if you agree or comment, that it's not so much a question for us of, the hurdles in front of us, but I think it's a question of the carrot. And, right now, I think psychiatry faces a problem that small molecule drugs are just not in vogue relative to biologics and other kind of complex therapeutics. And I think that really relates to how much the patent system has been beaten up. And, really, I think the most important thing that the government could do would be to establish some kind of a, non-patent-based exclusivity to spur research in the area. For example, in the antibiotic field, when that slowed down, there's the GAIN Act that was passed that gives 10 years of non-patent-based exclusivity to new qualifying small molecule antibiotics. Obviously, you're all familiar with the Orphan Act and the rest of it. So I guess my question is that for you, like us, you're probably looking at partnerships more than taking it through if you're starting at these early stages. How much would it help you? I think it would help us a lot. And, we've started to lay the groundwork of this, but so far we've been alone. To go out and advocate to Congress and say, please, identify service-related disabilities as an important area for new drug development, possibly other psychiatric conditions also. Because I think without that, small molecule drugs just can't compete for Big Pharma's attention with things like biologics that have 12 years of non-patent-based exclusivity. And I think that given the trickiness and the expense and the risk of developing CNS drugs, I think we really need that kind of help. So I hope that well, I'm curious about.
I'll take a shot at that. You know, it's oftentimes you look at things you can control and things you can't control, and within your time window, what you can control. I can't control what Washington's going to do. That sounds like a long effort, a concerted effort, but a long effort. I'll argue against that. The market's not there. 45% of the military people with PTSD don't seek treatment. 45% say no way. When I was in the teams, guys were like, you lose your mojo, you gain weight. They don't want to touch that stuff. The market is there. 2 million people, 10 million people, whatever number you want to use. The market is very large. It's just that the right drug hasn't come through. So I don't think it's necessarily a regulation problem. Even I love your idea, Seth. It's fantastic. We'd love to be in that world. I know I can't control it. I don't think it's going to change. Particularly with everything, particularly with where the environment with the EpiPen and all that discussion came around. That's not going to change. It's more the market's there. It's just got to be the right drug going. I think about, we keep on pointing to the military, but I have 3 investors that suffer from PTSD. And they weren't in the military. They had 2 had really bad childhood experiences, and 1 went through a very bad divorce, the loss of someone. I think PTSD, we all know the statistics out there, and it's a lot more prevalent from a lot more fully functional people. I always say, hey, go to Wall Street, and people, and the investors that have challenges with losing money and what they go through that chronic stress, they have symptoms of PTSD. The market's there, the drugs aren't. So that'd be my response. But go.
Yeah, I think. Look, I mean, there's no question, especially for CNS disorders, that everybody in the value chain, doctors, patients, payers, would prefer a pill over a biologic. I mean, why would you not take a pill if your alternative was an injectable or an infusion? So it's totally exclusivity driven, and I absolutely agree with you. I think from my perspective, though, I would challenge a little bit that there's such a preference for gene therapy and antibodies and other biologics. I think we are seeing quite a bit of new investment, both at the smaller company venture-backed level and in pharma, in rebuilding small molecule efforts in CNS. And I think that's encouraging. I mean, they're smaller molecular weight. They're going to be better drugs. If you can get some buy-in on that, I'm totally behind you. But I think that I wouldn't wait for that change to push forward a small molecule that makes sense.
Yeah, we're not waiting.
Yeah, I think those kinds of incentives certainly don't hurt, and certainly if there's people that have those kinds of connections that can help. I think what we've seen in the pediatric space and in the anti-infective space is it's paid off less in the changes of behavior in big pharmas than had initially been hoped. That being said, it is still an incentive when pieces of these regulations allow those vouchers to be applied for free market uses. So there's ways that you can use it to help shape behavior. But I think if we solve some of these more fundamental challenges with the exciting science that's coming through and some of the operational needs to make it easier, faster, and cheaper, that will probably have a bigger impact than the incentives. But the incentives will have an impact for some. It's just multifactorial.
Great. Well, I want to thank all the panelists for being with us today, and thank you for all the work you're doing to get us better treatments for these problems.